Sarvebhyo Namaha. Good evening, friends. We have gathered this evening for the annual day lecture of the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs. We have with us Sri Sandeep Balakrishna, who will speak on the historical method of history exemplars. To begin with, on behalf of the Institute, I extend a warm welcome to Sandeep Balakrishna ji. I also welcome all our listeners, those who have physically gathered here and those who are also participating online. The annual day gives us occasion every year to remind ourselves of the objectives that D.V. Gundappa, our venerable founder, had in mind when he began this institute. He named it after Balakrishna Gokhale, chiefly because of three reasons with which Gokhale was imbued. One, a selfless concern for the public good. Two, a scientific and objective study of facts. And three, constructive optimism. These incidentally are the foundational principles of liberalism as well. While one might not agree with the pacifist political stance of liberalism, nobody can brush aside its lofty principles. As the saying goes, ideas never die, and these are the reasons for DVG's choosing Balakrishna Gokhale as the force of inspiration behind this institute. DVG conceptualized the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs as an independent, non-party and non-communal socio-cultural organization. The aim of the institute is to work for strengthening the cultural roots of society and to serve as a center for the education of the public for responsible citizenship. Its motto, as everybody here is well aware, is public life must be spiritualized. Sandeep Balakrishna is the founder editor of the online portal, the Dharma Dispatch, where he writes about Indian history, culture, and contemporary events that are not discussed oftentimes on mainstream platforms. Sandeep is known for his hard-hitting style and has authored several important works, Invaders and Infidels, 2 volumes of which have appeared in print already, Reclaiming Bharatavarsha, Stories from Inscriptions, and many more. A novelist himself, Sandeep has translated into English 2 well-known novels of S.L. Bhairappa, Avarana and Tabbaliyu Neenade Magane. Now a couple of words on today's topic. I think Sandeep will restrict himself to Indian exemplars. While there is nothing like an Indian methodology of history, there is certainly historical scholarship rooted in India's cultural heritage, which is animated and sustained by the same heritage. A first-hand knowledge of the foundational texts in several disciplines and a proficiency of languages such as Sanskrit, Prakrit, Pali and other Indian languages marked out these exemplars. These apart, a thorough knowledge of allied disciplines such as epigraphy and numismatics were there to see as well. These traits are evident in the following works. If we take for instance Radha Kumud Mukherjee's small work, The Fundamental Unity of India, or Vasudeva Sharan Agrawala's exposition on the socio-cultural elements embedded in Panini's Ashtadhyayi, or R.C. Majumdar's exposition on the Southeast Asian nations which share a cultural unity with Bharatavarsha, Brihat Bharata, it might be Suvarnadvipa, Champa and so on. The same traits play out in all these works. Rigor and commitment to truth and overall a keen sense of patriotism or nationalism, which is unfortunately derided today, were the characteristic features of all these writers. Now the historical method of history exemplars is a very vast subject, and Sandeep, as a student and scholar of history, I am sure will do ample justice to the topic. His talks on the Vijayanagara history, which have been ongoing, have been very well received by all quarters. I request Sandeep to please accept a token of the Institute's respect and please begins today's talk. I request Sri Shatavadhani Dr. R. Ganesh to please come on stage and give Sandeep a small token of our respect. A small announcement. There will be distribution of sweets after the program. I request everybody to please collect the sweets while heading back home. Thank you.
Namaste, very good evening to all of you. As always, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be invited by the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs to deliver this lecture on today's topic, which is once again related to history, or rather historians, and Shashi has pretty much encapsulated my whole lecture. So the rest of this lecture will be an expansion of his summary, in a sense. So to be even more specific, today's topic relates, like Shashi said, to the historical method of some exemplars or luminaries of Indian history. But first, I'll give a brief flashback. About 3 years ago, this same venue, this same institution, the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs, it had organized a day-long seminar, or I think 2-day-long seminar, celebrating the legacies of some individual exemplars of the new Indian Renaissance hailing from Karnataka. In that seminar, it included some luminaries like Professor M. Hiriyanna, Shri DVG, Dr. S. Srikanta Shastri, Dr. K. Krishnamurthy, Dr. S.R. Rao, A.N. Upadhyay, B.A. Saletore, Sediyapu Krishna Bhatta, and so on. And in fact, the Gokhale Institute has had a very strong, long and laudable tradition of offering homage to the dignitaries and eminences who have contributed to enriched and ennobled our culture, countries, civilization and society, drawn from all walks of life, both past and present. And needless to say, this tradition of this institute was seeded by none other than the founder of JIPA, Shri D.V. Gundappa, and which reminds me of a beautiful kagga that kind of tangentially reflects this ideal of Gokhale Institute. Swasthateya kadalisada jagadasthayandu guna, aswasthayanu kundisada asthe. So actually, I didn't know how to approach it when Shashi, asked me to propose this topic. So we'll see how best I can deal with this. But it's good to set a brief kind of a context before we proceed. In that seminar that I just mentioned on the exemplars of Indian Renaissance from Karnataka, each luminary was selected for a rather detailed exposition of his life, achievements and legacy. And that seminar also focused on the exemplars drawn from various fields, not necessarily history. The gamut was rather wide. Art, aesthetics, archaeology, philosophy, history and so on. But the scope of today's lecture is limited to just the exemplars of Indian history, like I said. And even there, it is further limited to delineating just some of the major qualities, traits, and methods that made them what they were, the stalwarts and the exemplars in the domain of Indian history. For example, Radha Kumud Mukherjee, he did not become a giant of Indian history just by studying hundreds of books and manuscripts, nor did his greatness rest only upon the lasting volumes of history that he produced. His greatness has a deeper and a subtler quality, like I'll explain over the course of this session. And for the purposes of this lecture, I have selected just a few exemplars of Indian history at random because I think they are the representatives of that whole era. So, ಅನ್ನ ಆಗಿದೆ ಇಲ್ವಂತ ನೋಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಅಗಳು ಸಾಕು ಅಂತ ಇಲ್ಲೊಂದು 5-6 ಅಗಳ ಥರ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿರ್ಬೋದು, because it's impossible. And you don't have to take my word. Mahamahopadhyaya P.V. Kane, in his presidential address at the 13th session of the All India Oriental Conferences held at Nagpur on 19th October 1946, in that lecture itself consumes more than 32 pages. So, in that lecture, he gives a list of more than 150 top-notch history scholars in India at that time. And he also gives a list of more than 200 institutions engaged in history research. But the profound tragedy is that today, not a single scholar of even 1% of that caliber exists in a country of more than 140 crore people. That's 1/6 of humanity. Now, let me read out a few quotes about history as an academic discipline, as a philosophy, and even as a way of life. So, when I say way of life, it is used in a very comprehensive sense. For example, when you study the biographies of all these exemplars of Indian history, history was not just an academic discipline for them. It was something far beyond that. It was a way of life. And I'll give you concrete examples drawn from their own legacy to illustrate it. So, the first is by a contemporary American historian, great man, David McCullough. He died in 2022, and this is what he says about history. Quote, "The lessons of history are manifold. Nothing happens in isolation. Everything that happens has consequences. We are all part of a larger stream of events, past, present, and future. We are all the beneficiaries of those who went before us, who braved the unknown, who gave of their time and service, and who kept faith in the possibilities of the mind and the human spirit." This is a rather generic definition, and it's quite phrased quite attractively. The next is by Will Durant. This is what he says: "The record of the past can have a great deal of significance, but the events themselves have significance only if you approach them from a philosophical standpoint and ask the right questions." So out here, Will Durant is directly invoking the ancient Greek historian cum philosopher Dionysius, who said that history is philosophy teaching through examples. Another quote is by, ironically, a novelist named Vladimir Nabokov, who writes about historians. This is beautiful, actually. Quote, "The historian can do his best to unearth and combine all pertinent facts and details. He can frankly indulge in farce or satire by treating the past as a parody of the present." And then, when we go further back in time, we can look at the legendary Danish cum German historian B.G. Niebuhr. He is regarded as the founder of modern Western historiography, and this is what he says rather beautifully. Quote, "We must be able to say in the sight of God, I have not knowingly nor without earnest investigation written anything which is not true." Close quote. And Niebuhr was one of the earliest inspirations of our own historical stalwarts like R.C. Majumdar, who has expressed his debt of gratitude to Niebuhr and even Rank, for example. And so, let's look at a couple of quotes from R.C. Majumdar about history. "History must be regarded as an eternal quest for truth. This is a fundamental basis, everything else being only secondary and subordinate to it. Moral judgment as well as various inferences are welcome and even necessary only when the facts are established with a scrupulous regard for truth alone, without any influence of preconceived judgment, and afford sufficient materials for forming a judgment." Close quote. ಇಂಥ ಒಂದು ಸತ್ಯೈಕ ನಿಷ್ಠವಾದ್ರಿಂದನೇ ಗಾಂಧಿ Majumdar could write about Gandhi in very, very candid and frank terms, calling him that Gandhi was a dictator who tolerated no divergent views even from his staunchest followers. And after this, we can look at this quote from Majumdar's senior contemporary, the distinguished historian, the pioneer of Indian historiography, the great scholar, Acharya Jadunath Sarkar. This is really awesome. "I would not care whether truth is pleasant or unpleasant, and in consonance with or opposed to current views. I would not mind in the least whether truth is or is not a blow to the glory of my country. If necessary, I shall bear in patience the ridicule and slander of friends and society for the sake of preaching the truth. But still, I shall seek truth, understand truth, and accept truth. This should be the firm resolve of a historian. And he lived like this. And Sarkar is undoubtedly the pioneer of Indian history writing, and what he has given here is an eternal motto of a historian which closely adheres to the spirit of Vedanta. Jadunath Sarkar and other giants of his caliber, his mettle, were the real founders of Indian historiography and history writing in its truest and its most objective sense, even detached sense in a manner. Another quality that elevates their eminence is the fact that they worked in a period of extreme hardship and even lethal constraints. The first great constraint was the fact that they wrote in English, which was a thoroughly alien language, the language of their own oppressors. When we read some of their biographies, it is clear that their greatest struggles with learning and articulating in English formed huge obstacles during their formative education. Second, they faced the clear and present danger of falling afoul of the colonial British government, which could and which did destroy the careers of many Indian historians and scholars for writing or speaking uncomfortable truths. The case of how John Marshall ruthlessly suppressed the findings of Rakhaldas Banerjee related to the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro inscriptions, excavations, and unmasking which would disprove the hoax called Aryan invasion theory. That unfortunate story is well known. And the third constraint or the third factor is quite important. When we look at the histories of various civilizations and nations, it is clear that reconstructing Indian history, especially ancient Indian history, with accuracy and truthfulness is still the toughest task even today. All the pre-Abrahamic ancient civilizations and cultures and societies have vanished, and so it is relatively easier to make informed conjectures about their histories. But this is not the case with India, because our people have preserved substantial memories of their own past. That is, our history is a living civilization, it is a living culture, it is a throbbing, vibrant, living society. And to add to this, there is one more difficulty. In the period during which these stalwarts of Indian history worked, reconstructing the history of ancient India especially was almost like walking blindfolded with both hands tied behind their back. Because they had no past masters or research precedents to guide them. Archaeology, epigraphy, manuscriptology, numismatics, these were all disciplines that were still evolving in Europe itself. And so applying these emergent disciplines to reconstruct our past involved superhuman efforts, and there was every possibility that even a small mistake, a small oversight could result in major blunders. And in short, these luminaries had to carve out the path from the scratch. They had to literally dig the earth and make the road. ತಾತ್ಪರ್ಯತಃ ಹೇಳೋ ಹಾಗಿದ್ರೆ, ಇವರು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದಂತಹ ಕಾಲ ಅದು ಅಭಾವದ ಕಾಲ, ದುರ್ಭಿಕ್ಷದ ಕಾಲ, ಕ್ಷಾಮದ ಕಾಲ. ಆದರೂ ಅಂಥದ್ರಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಇವರು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಸಮೃದ್ಧವಾದ ಉತ್ಕೃಷ್ಟವಾದ ಸುಗ್ಗಿನೇ ತೆಗೆದ್ರು ಅಂತ ಧಾರಾಳವಾಗಿ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. Which is exactly where their real eminence lies. And the body of work produced by these giants still remains unsurpassed. Their succeeding generations of historians, their students, other scholars who came after them, they have only supplemented or added to their bequest, but none have equaled or rivaled them till date. I'll take just 3 random examples to illustrate this point. P.V. Kane's History of Dharma Shastra can anyone, can all the scholars in all Indian universities working together as one army come even close to this work? No. Or Jadunath Sarkar's History of Aurangzeb? Impossible. And even Dr. S. Srikanta Shastri's Sources of Karnataka History. He rewrote the manuscript from scratch 3 times, all from memory. And these are among several reasons why these stalwarts could accomplish so much, both in quality and abundance. The foremost reason, I think, was the fact that they regarded history as history. For them, history was the quest for truth, and it was not an extension counter of politics or ideology. The second reason was their inner attitude which they brought to the study of history. When we read their lectures, when we read their prefaces or introductions, even book reviews written for other works, when we look at all that, they invariably describe themselves as devoted or faithful workers of history. They call themselves as the sons and servants of Bharata Mata. Jadunath Sarkar, for example, treated history research as a lifelong tapas. He regarded it as a form of asceticism and a sacred calling. Radha Kumud Mukherjee saw history as a source of profound insight. For instance, in his brilliant work, it's a very early work, Men of Thought of Ancient India. In that book, he devotes the very first chapter to Maharshi Yajnavalkya, a great revelation in itself of that scholar's mindset. The third and perhaps the most important reason is this. Almost without exception, these savants of Indian history were deeply rooted in Sanatana Dharma, its culture, its society, its ideals, its ethos. They had received their primary education pretty much in the traditional manner, first at home, then either in a Gurukula or in the typical village school that had existed in every nook and corner of Bharatavarsha. ಈ ಹಳ್ಳಿ ಶಾಲೆಗಳು ಸರ್ವನಾಶ ಆಗಿದ್ದರ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಪರಿಣಾಮ ಇವತ್ತು ನಾವು ಅನುಭವಿಸ್ತಾ ಇರೋ ಒಂದು ವಾಟ್ ಯು ಕಾಲ್ ಕ್ಷಾಮ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದು. ಐ ಡೋಂಟ್ ವಾಂಟ್ ಟು ಯೂಸ್ ಅ ಸ್ಟ್ರಾಂಗರ್ ವರ್ಡ್. ಸೊ R.C. Majumdar, for example, he practiced the Bangla alphabet on dried banana leaves and he wrote on them. He practiced his lessons till he reached high school. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಶಿಪ್ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದ ಮೇಲೆ ಪೆನ್ನು ಪೇಪರು ಪೆನ್ಸಿಲ್ ದರ್ಶನ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅವರಿಗೆ. Jadunath Sarkar, he was a son of a very wealthy zamindar. He knew the whole of Jayadeva and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu by heart before he had reached his 6th standard. And as a boy, he was encouraged by his zamindari father to sit in the village square and listen to discourses and bhajans and sankirtans by various sadhus, sants and pravachanakartas. And so, this same man who wrote so prolifically on Aurangzeb and Shivaji also wrote an extremely erudite and moving masterpiece on Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and a beautiful volume on the history of Dashanami Naga Sannyasis, and his heart melted upon reading Ramanujacharya's treatises and shlokas on Sharanagati and Prapatti. By the time he was 10 years old, Parashuram Krishna Gode, P.K. Gode, he had memorized the whole of Amarakosha and Bhartrahari Shatakas and hundreds of assorted Subhashitas. Our own Dr. S. Srikanta Shastri, he had also received a thoroughly traditional Sanskrit training in his boyhood in Nanjangud. And with some latitude, I can confidently claim that theirs was the last generation which had received such a fully grounded early education, especially language education and especially education in Sanskrit language. And it goes without saying that their learning in their respective mother tongue was of a similar standard. They primarily thought in their mother tongue, although they wrote in English. And in a sense, they were natural polyglots. Most of them wrote both in English and their mother tongues, be it Kannada, Marathi, Bengali, Gujarati or Hindi. For example, Dr. K.B. Vyas, he wrote the most authoritative translation of Padmanabha's narrative poem, Kanhadade Prabandha. This K.B. Vyas was fluent in Hindi, Gujarati, Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, Apabhramsha, Farsi, and an extinct dialect of Rajasthani, which was spoken in the Maru region or Marwad Pranta, Alli. And a majority of these scholars had also mastered other foreign languages like German, Japanese, French, Greek, Latin, and so on, which raises the obvious question. If they could do all this in less than a century ago, why are history scholars of today unable to do it, especially when information, travel, and resources are so easily available? And now, we can look at the fourth reason, which is equally important. These exemplary scholars of history, they toiled in their field in a purposeful fashion. They saw history as a means to discover both the good and the regrettable events of our past, and they wanted an answer to a basic question. How did a country, how did a civilization that was the global hub of philosophy, education, wealth, culture, and bravery for more than a millennium fall into such a sorry mess? They wanted to find out the answer to this question. How did this civilization fall under the rule of a handful of pirates and brigands from a tiny island nation of traders and shopkeepers? From this perspective, these giants of Indian history were also freedom fighters. And now, we will get into the heart of today's session. The ubiquitous element in the method of these exemplars of Indian history is their emphasis upon and their fidelity for primary sources, coins, inscriptions, literary works, manuscripts, letters, official documents, edicts, archaeological sources, and so on. None of them wrote derivative or secondary or tertiary history. We notice this quality in their volumes as well as their individual papers submitted to various academic journals. They went to extraordinary lengths to procure these primary sources, often at very great personal cost, and even suffered health hazards in the process. I'll just give a few examples to illustrate this health hazards and in general how they worked. The first example is V.K. Rajwade. He was one of the greatest historians of Maharashtra who primarily wrote in Marathi. He was a prolific collector, compiler, and scholar of old letters and other official documents related to the period of Shivaji and the Maratha Empire. Generally speaking, the history of Maharashtra. This extraordinary man, he once issued a public letter in various newspapers requesting the people of Maharashtra to send him any old letter, Shasana, Bakhair, Daftar, meaning official records, that they had in their possession. And if an individual could not send it, all they had to do was send him an inland letter card, 15 paisa, inland letter card, and he would personally travel to their houses, which he did for more than 30 years. Let's listen to his story in his own words. Quote, the work of unearthing historical papers mildewed with dampness and which are lying in remote attics, lumbers, and nooks and corners is fraught with considerable danger. Ordinarily, there is no escaping a cleansing bath. Ordinarily, there is no escaping a cleansing bath and sending the clothes to a washerman after completing the task of hunting out, dusting, and selecting from old records and manuscripts in private houses. More than half of the time is occupied in fighting with ants, moths, and insects which are moving in and out of the holes in the covering cloth, which looks like a sieve, and which may be likened to Indra, who is called thousand-old. It is not an old record if in it are not found pieces of old rags or old saris, tatters of crumbling khadi, decayed binding laces, rotten skin covers, and worm-eaten boards of wood. In the process of undergoing the penance involved in the act of research of old records, the nose is filled with repulsive odor, the eyelashes are deposited with dust, the head is fully covered with cobwebs as to be practically entangled in a net, and such a painful scratching sensation is experienced in all the pores of the body for 5 or 10 days. One remains in a constant dread of suffering from the evil effects resulting from such work. ಈ ಒಂದು ಪ್ಯಾರಾಗ್ರಾಫ್ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಪೇಂಟಿಂಗ್ ಬರಿಬೋದು. ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಸೋ ವಿವಿಡ್. ಪಾಪ ಪುಣ್ಯಾತ್ಮರು, he has undergone this kind of trouble, like I said, for more than 25 years. For what joy? Nobody, even half the people in this country, what half? 90% of the people in this country have not even heard this man's name. The result of such superhuman labor was the production of his masterly work. Its title is Sources of Maratha History, which runs into 22 volumes. What is notable here is that Rajwade was a Kattar Orthodox Maharashtrian Brahmin of the 19th century. ಅವರು ಎಲ್ಲೇ ಇರಲಿ, ಎಲ್ಲೇ ಹೋಗಲಿ, ಪ್ರತಿನಿತ್ಯ ತಪ್ಪದೇ ಸಂಧ್ಯಾವನ್ನೇ, ಜಪ, ಅನುಷ್ಠಾನ ಇವೆಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಂಡೇ ಮುಂದಿನ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ಸೊ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್, ಸಂಧ್ಯಾವನ್ನೆಗೆ ಅನುಷ್ಠಾನಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇಕಾಗಿದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ಜೋಳಿಗೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹಾಕ್ಕೊಂಡು, ಪಾಪ ಬೇರೆ ಬಟ್ಟೆನ ಟ್ರಂಕಲ್ಲಿ ತಲೆ ಮೇಲೆ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಈ ಥರ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡಿ ಕಲೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬಂದು ಪುಣ್ಯಾತ್ಮರಿವರು. ಸೊ ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ವೈ ಹಿ ಸೇಸ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್ ಧೋಬಿಗೆ ಬಟ್ಟೆ ಕಳ್ಸೋಕ್ಕೆ ಹುಡ್ಕೋದೇ ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಯಿತು ಅಂತ ಪಾಪ ಈ ಥರ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಕೆಲಸ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಹಿ ಈಸ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ರೆಕಾರ್ಡೆಡ್ ವಿತ್ ಗ್ರೇಟ್ ಆ್ಯಂಗರ್ that he was unable to find a proper river bank to perform these daily rituals, sometimes in remote villages where he had gone to unearth these historical documents, or how in some villages there was not a single Brahmin house and he had to spend the night on the portico of some temple or under some tree, and that he was also forced to live on fruits and raw vegetables, and he had to drink pond water. ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಪಾಪ ಅವರೇ ಬರ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ದ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಈಸ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಮಹಾರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ. ಅನದರ್ ಟವರಿಂಗ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟಾರಿಯನ್, ಗೋವಿಂದ್ ಸಖಾರಾಮ್ ಸರ್ದೇಸಾಯಿ. He was a close friend of Jadunath Sarkar. We owe a lasting debt of gratitude to both Rajwade and Sardesai for giving us almost the entire corpus of primary sources for the study of the history of Maharashtra, including valuable primary sources related not just to the Maratha Empire, but to the Mughal Empire, the later Rajputs, the families of Scindia, Gaekwad, Holkar, Hyder Ali, Tippu Sultan, Nizam of Hyderabad, Nawab of Arcot, and the East India Company. To give just a brief idea of the kind of output that Sardesai produced, I'll read out some statistics. His selections from Peshwa Daftar, it runs into 47 volumes, running into 8,650 documents spread over 8,000 printed pages. Likewise, his other work, Pune Residency Correspondence, it runs into 14 volumes spread over 7,193 pages and contains 4,159 letters. All these documents were written in the following languages: Modi, Marathi, Gujarati, English, and Farsi. In fact, Sardesai sat at the feet of Jadunath Sarkar and he took tuitions from him in Farsi just to read these letters. And when you read Sardesai's introduction to these volumes, those introductions are education by themselves. But then Sardesai did not stop at just this. He also produced a series of genealogies, Vamshavali antaralla adu, related to more than 400 notable families in Maharashtra. to describe this in common terms, you take any Maharashtrian surname, any common Maharashtrian surname, and you will invariably find its family tree in this work. For example, Atre, Apte, Angre, Ingale, Upadhya, Kane, Katre, Karve, Kashi, Chavan, Gode, Lele, Mehendale, Gune, Gupte, Nagarkar, Dhume, Pant, Patankar, Fadke, Fadnis, Fadnavis, Poddar, Sardesai, Samant, Shirke, Vaidya, Vavle, Vyas, ಈ ಥರ 400 ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ ನೇಮ್ಸ್ ಅಷ್ಟು ವಂಶಾವಳಿ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇನ್ಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ Sardesai has candidly declared the attitude that Indian historians must possess towards this sacred vocation called history research. Indians alone can study and accurately interpret the records and materials of India's past. Many earlier histories written by a number of eminent Western scholars have become obsolete, if not entirely misleading. In the next paragraph of this essay, he takes Grant Duff to task severely. Sikapata baididara. And Sardesai led a highly energetic, a very, very productive and useful life of 94 long years, of which he dedicated more than 70 years to doing such pioneering fundamental work of history research. In fact, we can do a separate lecture on the life and legacy of this great scholar. The third example is that of Rao Bahadur S. Krishnaswamy Iyengar. He was one of the path-breaking historians of the Vijayanagara Empire, and I think I've already spoken about his contributions to Vijayanagara in the first season of my lecture series on Vijayanagar. Here, I'll mention just a couple of anecdotes that give us some insights into his brilliance, his passion, and his method of history. Krishnaswamy Iyengar, he actually studied to become a mathematician, but he became attracted to history when he was 28 years old. He was also instrumental in the founding of the Mythic Society, and he became its first secretary and the first editor of its journal. Perhaps the greatest contribution of Krishnaswamy Iyengar was, like I said, his research in the Vijayanagara Empire. His sources of Vijayanagara history is truly a monumental feat. In one shot, that work steered the field in an entirely new direction, and it stripped off its biases of colonial historians like Robert Sewell, Father Heras, and others. Shri Iyengar supplied the much needed course corrections to the reading of Vijayanagara inscriptions and also supplemented it with copious literary and other primary sources. Professor Tate, he was a renowned principal of Central College, Bangalore, and he gives us an incident that made Krishnaswamy Iyengar embrace history as his life's mission. I'll just summarize what Tate has written. Sometime in the year 1896 or 97, the archaeology department found an inscription in Chitradurga, and it discovered that no one in southern India could decipher it. That's the literal verbiage. So they sent the inscription to an Indology scholar in Vienna, Austria, who basically concluded that it belonged to the age of Ashoka. And when Krishnaswamy Iyengar heard of this news, he was deeply sad and dismayed, and that made him decide to pursue history as his lifelong passion. And this is how Tate describes Shri Iyengar's decision, quote, "At that time, a young scholar taking up studies in this field had little prospect of material reward. He had no aids to study in the shape of a library or in the stimulus of fellow workers. Only courage, sustained by a genuine love of learning, could have enabled him to remain faithful to his decision for 20 years, during which his ordinary work left him with little leisure." Now we can turn to the fourth example, again Dr. S. Shrikanta Shastri, who was not merely a towering historian, but a phenomenon of sorts. ಇತಿಹಾಸದ ಒಂದು ಮೂಲ ಆಕರಗಳನ್ನು ಎಷ್ಟು ಪ್ರಭಾವಶಾಲಿಯಾಗಿ ಬಳಸ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೋದು ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಮಾರ್ಗವನ್ನು ಈ ಮಹಾನುಭಾವರು ಅನ್ಯಾದೃಶವಾಗಿ ತೋರಿಸ್ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಇನ್ ಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ he has offered a highly illuminating guidance on this subject in his classic work Puratattva Shodhane. In the introduction of that work, he talks about epigraphy and archaeology, but his advice is equally applicable to other areas of historical research, and I'll read out a small excerpt from it. What is the benefit of studying archaeology and epigraphy? The foremost duty of epigraphy is to unearth truths. To what extent can we learn about our culture through lifeless epigraphic or archaeological fossils? Things like the mind and Atman are not research topics in the true sense. The human body is a collection of fluids that don't cost more than 5 rupees. However, what is known as Atma Samskriti or the culture of the soul is invaluable. In that case, this question arises: to what extent can epigraphy reveal this Atma Samskriti? Archaeology and epigraphy rely on the aids provided by the physical sciences. However, unlike these sciences, one cannot arrive at definitive conclusions solely through epigraphy. Epigraphy is thus also an art in and by itself. The study of epigraphy will not attain fruition by merely collecting facts. The researcher must also be an artist and a connoisseur. Along with collecting artifacts, he must also expound upon their real meaning that elevates the intellect and ennobles the emotion. This sort of insight cannot emerge from a mere dry academic historian. It can come only from a person who is deeply anchored to Vedanta and Kalamimamsa, broadly speaking, and the overall tradition of Sanatana Dharma, and a person who is attuned to detect the invisible and living connections that all these disciplines have with lifeless descriptions such as coins. Dr. Shrikanta Shastri's Bharatiya Samskriti is, in my opinion, the best embodiment of his own dictum. Next, we can look at some aspects of the working style and methods of other titans of Indian history. I'll begin with Jadunath Sarkar once again. In 1958, Sarkar wrote a delightful essay titled How My Library Grew. And I'll read out a couple of extracts from it, and I highly recommend reading all this. I have given the complete essay on Dharma Dispatch. You can read it. It's phenomenal. So, ashtu odbeku, but time illa. Quote: after passing the matric exam in 1887, it became my passion to buy rare books on Indian history. My educational expenses were paid by my father, and I was free to spend all my own money from the first grade scholarship which I enjoyed throughout my college life on these India books. The second-hand booksellers of Calcutta found in me their most liberal and their most gullible patron, and thus the rare books on Indian history discarded by European clubs, barracks, and private owners like Prince Ghulam Hussain, the last grandson of Tipu Sultan who died in Calcutta, were first offered to me. I thus laid the foundation of my historical library, but when I passed the Premchand examination in 1897 and undertook original research, my library grew and branched like the proverbial banyan tree. I discarded my Calcutta suppliers and began to give large orders year after year to the famous second-hand booksellers of England. After 30 years, this stream stopped through the fullness of collection and also the demands of my new love. Original research with the help of Persian, Marathi, and English manuscripts and records. The result is that today my collection of Persian manuscripts and Marathi printed sources is indispensable to the students of our medieval history, as it has brought together in one place the necessary works which are scattered in many towns of India and the famous public libraries of Europe. For example, India Office, British Museum, the Bodleian Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris, and the Royal Library of Berlin, besides Casvini's metrical history of Nadir Shah, of which there is only one manuscript in the world in Leningrad. Its copy was available in Jadunath Sarkar's personal library. I equate myself with the very necessary survey of India maps, regardless of its cost. The oldest scientifically drawn map of British India is of priceless worth to me, as it gives the result of the survey before the Sepoy Mutiny and the railways changed the face of India. The historic but now discarded routes and village names are to be found here only. ಅದು ಈ ಹೊತ್ತಿಗೂ ಸಿಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಈ ಮ್ಯಾಪ್ ಇವರೊಬ್ಬರ ಹತ್ರನೇ ಇರೋದು. There is no end to this quest, this search for buried truth, which we call research. Extraordinary. Then we have the redoubtable Pandurang Vaman Kane. A few years ago, my friends Kashyap Naik, Hari Ravi Kumar and Raghavendra, they visited Shri Shantaram Kane. He is a grandson of P.V. Kane. They visited them at his house in Pune, and they sat with him for several days and gathered invaluable information about several unknown facets of this great stalwart of Dharma Shastra. It is published as a series on the Preksha Journal, its website. Let me quote some of the most delectable and inspiring passages from it. Shri Kane would wake up by 5:15 or 5:30 every morning, and by 6 he took a stroll at the Malabar Hills in Bombay. He would climb up the hill and return to his home by 7. Then for an hour and a half, he would study the Dharmashastra texts or other legal commentaries, or at times read the journals he had subscribed to. He got ready by 9 or 9:15 and left for court. At times, when there were very few matters in his docket, he would head to the Royal Asiatic Library and study the subjects of his interests, including Dharmashastra texts. He would then meet his clients and prepare for the next day's work, sitting in his chambers till 6:30 in the evening. Then he would return home, take a short tea break, and start working on his monumental work, History of the Dharmashastra, from 7 till about 9:30 p.m., only to break for dinner in the midst of his work. This was his routine for at least 38 years, during which period he wrote more than 6,000 pages that make up his masterpiece. While reading several chapters of the history of Dharmashastra, we all noticed that P.V. Kane has referred to manuscripts, books and journals available at some library in Nepal, Delhi, a corner of northeastern India, in the heart of South India, and so forth. I was wonderstruck as to how he could go to these places simply to refer to a single manuscript and on the subject. PVK would visit libraries at far-off places, sometimes combining it with family vacations and sometimes alone, like his visits to Jaipur and Tanjavur. Close quote. ಆ ಪೂರ್ತಿ ಓದಬೇಕು ನೀವು, ತುಂಬ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಕಶ್ಯಪ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಟೀಮ್. And like I said, at this rate I'd have to read out the whole series. So, but the last point that Kashyap makes here is very significant, that how Kane traveled all the way to Nepal to read just one manuscript. And remember what I just mentioned about how Rajwade undertook similar tours to all sorts of remote places throughout Maharashtra to get rare but precious historical documents. It is clear that ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಹಂಸಗೀತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ತಾರಾಸು ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಬರೀತಾರೆ, ಹೇಗೆ ವೆಂಕಟ ಸುಬ್ಬಯ್ಯ ಅನ್ನೋ ಮಹಾನ್ ಸಂಗೀತಗಾರರು, ಅವರು ವಂಶಿಕರು ಕೊನೆಗೆ ₹2 ಅವರಷ್ಟು ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್ನ ಕೊಟ್ಬಿಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರ ಕೃತಿಗಳು ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಕಣ್ಣಲ್ಲಿ ನೀರು ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ದಿಸ್ ಈಸ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಕ್ಟ್ಲಿ ದ ಫೇಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಆಲ್ ದೀಸ್ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಸ್. ಅವ್ರ ಮನೆಯವ್ರಿಗೆ ಬೇಕಾಗಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಎನಿವೆ, ಸೊ ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ that this kind of self-imposed commitment was a trait that all these stalwarts of Indian history shared. And I will cite another example in this regard. This time, it is the example of Shri V.S. Sukhtankar. He is a prodigious editor, scholar and compiler of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. This extraordinary scholar travelled not once but twice all the way from Pune to a remote village named Porumamilla in Kadapa district to decipher an inscription related to the Vijayanagara Empire. This inscription is known in archaeological circles as the Porumamilla tank inscription because it was found outside the Bhairava temple overlooking the large lake in that village. Porumamilla Kere Shasana. So Sukhtankar on both occasions stayed in that village for several days, and he spoke to the locals and the district magistrate of Kadapa and gathered every minute detail of the region. If that was not enough, he physically entered the lake of Porumamilla. It is known as Anantasagara, which was built by a Chola king in the 12th century. Sukhtankar also measured the whole lake, and he took precise details of its dimensions as mentioned in the inscription. The unit of measurement in that inscription is in Rekha Danda, which is approximately 1.25 yards or about 1.15 feet. And for the exact dating of the inscription, he corresponded with various scholars throughout India and finally found the most accurate dating, which was supplied by the renowned Tamil historian Swami Kannu Pillai. He also studied various Dharmashastra texts because some of those quotations appear in that inscriptions in order to understand the nuances there, and ultimately in a couple of verses in the inscription he found a reference to Hemadri's Danakhanda in his encyclopedic treatise on Dharma Shastra titled Chaturvarga Chintamani. You know, I am not done, okay? What is more interesting is that this Porumamilla lake inscription is basically a typical Danashasana speaking about a dam that was constructed across a small rivulet in Porumamilla named Madevi. But Sukhtankar's all-seeing eye, Haddina Kannu, and his encyclopedic scholarship, it has given us a short but a brilliant treatise on this one inscription. Abbabba andre 100 ಲೈನ್ಗಿನ ಕಮ್ಮಿ ಇದೆ ಅದು ಶಾಸನ, ಆರ್ ಸ್ಲೈಟ್ಲಿ ಮೋರ್ ದೆನ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್. ಒಂದೊಂದು ಅಕ್ಷರ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಇದು ಒನ್ ಹಿ ಈಸ್ ಗಿವನ್ ಅಸ್ ಒನ್ ಎಂಟೈರ್ ಟ್ರೀಟೈಸ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ಸ್ ಟು ಹಿಸ್ ಡಿಸೈಫರ್ಮೆಂಟ್, ದ Porumamilla lake inscription has become one of the primary sources for reconstructing the history of the irrigation system of the Vijayanagara Empire. And now after Sukhtankar, we can consider his junior contemporary and his colleague at Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. His name is Parashuram Krishna Gode, P.K. Gode. Gode is unique in the sense that in a scholarly career spanning more than 3 decades, he never once travelled out of his Karma Bhumi, Pune. He is also unique in another sense. Perhaps no other historical scholar of India took up, bizarrely offbeat topics for deep, exhaustive and sustained research. I'll just read out some topics of his research at random. History of soap nut powder, Sigekai Itihasa. Firearms in ancient India. History of the nose ring. History of Rangavalli from 50 CE up to 1900 CE. Massage techniques in ancient India. History of jalebi. History of castor oil. History of camphor. History of rope manufacture in India from 300 BCE up to 1900 CE. biographies of medieval clerks in the courts of various Hindu kings, names of obscure yagnas, ilella ಇವರಲ್ಲೇ ಸಿಗೋದು ಇವೆಲ್ಲ ಟಾಪಿಕ್ಸು. In fact, we can do a separate lecture on this understudied, highly underrated scholar. ಇಂಥ ಟಾಪಿಕ್ಸು ನಮಗೆ ಹೇರಳವಾಗಿ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ. ಈಸ್ ಲೆಫ್ಟ್ ಬಿಹೈಂಡ್ ಐ ಥಿಂಕ್ 6 volumes called Cultural History of Papers of India. But fortunately for us, Shri Gode has written about his methods of work, briefly, how he did his research, and I'll read out a couple of lines from it. Quote, "To me, all old manuscripts, documents, printed books, scraps, not to say other sources of history, are worthy of reverence and careful preservation. The wider and deeper the acquaintance of an investigator with the known sources, the larger is a number of problems that crop up. He alone is a complete angler and the fisherman. He alone is a complete angler in historical research who sits patiently on the shores of antiquity by casting a close and comprehensive net of knotty problems and catches daily some new facts bearing on the solution. I have practiced such angling on the shores of Indian antiquity, commensurate with the scanty leisure at my disposal. I have under investigation innumerable problems and have maintained separate problem files for them. Facts bearing on these problems, as soon as they are discovered, are noted on separate sheets with indication of their chronology and inserted in these files." Direct tuition ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಹೆಂಗೆ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಂತ. When a sufficient number of analogous facts clarifying a problem is gathered in due course, these facts are released in the form of an article. Sometimes it takes years before a problem is completely solved. But if an investigator toils diligently year after year, he is sure to be rewarded by a decent number of original research papers. Close quote. ತುಂಬ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿದೆ, ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಓದಲೇಬೇಕು. And in the same essay, he mentions how he always kept in mind a timeless warning from the Yoga Vasishta. Yenabhyasah parityaktah ishte vastuni saha adhamaha. He is the meanest wretch who abandons constant practice in the pursuit of his ideal. As always, I have the same question. Why are we unable to produce scholars even of 10% of this caliber? Next, we can turn to Sri Vasudeva Sharan Agarwala, who started out as a semi-historian, but he finished his mortal journey as a profound spiritualist and almost like a sannyasi or a virakta towards the end of his life. ಈ ಮಹಾನುಭಾವರು ಮುಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಬಂಗಾರ ಆಯಿತು. His earliest magnum opus, India as known to Panini, is by itself a majestic, it's a masterly study in exacting historical scholarship, and that is putting it really mildly. One of his foremost disciples, Srimati Kapila Vatsyayan, she has written a deeply moving and a very reverential tribute to her guru, and I'll read out a couple of portions from it. Many have spoken of his versatility, his wide range, and his phenomenal intellectual growth. I can only speak of the gifts I have received from him of his vision, of discipline, and of knowledge. The first impression he made was of a man with a fund of information and knowledge. I had occasion to watch him closely in Banaras when he showed the direction of research to his students. The few remarks made by Vasudeva ji on the need to know one's country better before one traveled abroad, the dates and the enthusiasm of the many armed images of Hindu sculpture, all these acquired new meaning now. City to city, village to village, and temple to temple, I traveled, exploring, imbibing, and finding my own roots. He was preoccupied and far away. As a concession to your presence, he would ask you to pick up pen and paper and order you to begin taking dictation. I have been witness to his dictation in one session on Indian art, on Vedanta, on Panini, and the works of the Janapada tradition to 3 different people at the same time. ಹಿಂಗೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ಇದನ್ನ, ಹಿಂಗೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಅವಧಾನನೇ ಇದು. This phenomenal erudition, with an unmistakable mark of deep intellectual organization, was as bewildering as it was impressive. The seemingly unrelated subjects or fields he attacked at a given moment showed an inner cohesiveness. Remember what I spoke about S.T. Kandashastri. Same thing. The joy of revelation accompanied every scholastic effort. The totality of the experience was the gift. Close quote. If this is a first-hand testimony of a direct disciple who was herself a scholar of a high standard, we get some glimpses of his vision and his methods in his own words. He rarely wrote about himself. Shri Vasudeva Sharan Agarwal was not an armchair scholar. He followed the same tradition as that of his predecessors, including and seniors, including V.S. Sukthankar, P.V. Kane and others, through extensive travel. Radha Kumud Mukherjee, through extensive travel and interaction with people of all social strata. In one place, he records his debt of gratitude, guess to whom? To the ordinary boatmen of Varanasi and Triveni Sangama, who taught him new technical words related to boating, shipping and navigation. Let me quote his own words. The bow of a boat or a ship is termed as Galahi, Matha and Mukha. The decoration of the bow with animal heads is termed as Gilasa by the boatmen of Varanasi. This word could be derived from Grasa, which in Sanskrit architectural terminology is synonymous with Simhamukha. Many technical terms used by boatmen sailing in the rivers and seas could be thus usefully gathered. Maiku, a boatman plying his boat on the Triveni Sangam of Allahabad, informed me that at one time 1,000 boats such as Patiala, Mahelia, Dakela, Ulaki, Dogi, Bajara, Malhani, Bhaulia, Panasuya, Qatar, Badaria, etc. plied on these very rivers. I am indebted to him for the following terms. ಹೀಗೆ ಹೇಳಿ ಒಂದು 30-40 ಟೆಕ್ನಿಕಲ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ಸ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅಗರ್ವಾಲ್ ಅವರು. And his approach and his method once again illustrates the same truth. Scholarship divorced from life and the living culture and society is barren at best and misleading and dangerous at worst, which is exactly what's happening now. And now we can round off today's session with another Himalayan scholar of Indian history, Shri Anand Sadashiv Altekar. Throughout his distinguished career, Shri Altekar wore many different hats. As a scholar of history, as a numismatist, as an archaeologist, and as a cultural chronicler. His gamut and his range of scholarship is rather vast and varied. To give just a sample, it was Shri Altekar who first wrote the comprehensive history of the Rashtrakuta Empire. He was also the first compiler of the full history of Banaras in a book called History of Banaras, Past and Present. His other path-breaking work was Education in Ancient India, which is a majestic volume on Indian education from the Vedic times up to 1200 CE. That is from the Vedic era up to the establishment of the so-called Delhi Sultanate. This book precedes the other famous work on Indian education by Radha Kumud Mukherjee, Education in Ancient India. The choice of this period by Shri Altekar is by itself very revealing. This book was published in 1934 and it was immediately condemned by British historians and scholars. Undoubtedly so, because of the kind of, more than anybody else, the British were keenly aware of the kind of damage that they inflicted by uprooting ancient systems of Indian education. If most of you might have read Dharampal's Beautiful Tree, it is a very brutal, a very tragic and painful account of this British massacre of Indian history. And another masterpiece of Dr. Altekar was the position of women in Hindu civilization from prehistoric times to the present day, that is 1938, which is the year in which this work was published. This book was the first comprehensive historical survey of the status and the evolution of Hindu women throughout our history. In the dedication of this book, this is what Sri Altekar writes, and I quote him: "Dedicated to the sacred and beloved memory of my mother, Saubhagyavati Parvati Bai Altekar, who was an ideal Hindu sadhvi." This wording itself, I think, sets the tone for the work, and when it was published, it had the rare distinction of being widely condemned and criticized both by traditional Indian society and by the British. ನಮ್ಮ ವರ್ಣಾಶ್ರಮ ಧರ್ಮ, ನಮ್ಮ ಹಿಂದೂ ಸಾಧ್ವಿಗಳನ್ನು ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ನೀವು ಹಾಳು ಮಾಡಿಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀರಾ ಬೈ giving unorthodox views ಅಂತ. He has already preempted these criticisms in his introduction itself, and he says that truth is my only defense and my guide, and if anybody has valid criticisms to disprove it by primary sources, you are welcome ಅಂತ ಆಗಲೇ ಡಿಫೆನ್ಸು ಮಾಡಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಈವನ್ ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ನಮ್ಮವರು ಇದು ಅನ್ಆರ್ಥೋಡಾಕ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಬೈದರೆ, ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಅವರು ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ಡೀಪ್ಲಿ ರಿಗ್ರೆಸಿವ್ ಅಂತ ಬೈದರು. ಸೊ ಈ ಥರ ಇದೆ ಪಾಪ ಆಲ್ಟೇಕರ್ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿ. ಆಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಯು ಶುಡ್ ರೀಡ್ ದಿಸ್ ರಾದರ್ ಐ ಓಪನಿಂಗ್ ವರ್ಕ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅನದರ್ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಫಾರ್ಮ್ ಎಸ್ಸೆ, ಐ ಥಿಂಕ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ ಮೊನೋಗ್ರಾಫ್, ರಿಲೇಟ್ಸ್ ಟು ವಾಟ್ ಈಸ್ ನೋನ್ ಎಸ್ ಗರ್ವಾಪ್ಸಿ. ತುಂಬ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿದೆ ವರ್ಕ್ ಅದು. ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಪ್ರೈಮರ್ಲಿ ಬೇಸ್ಡ್ ಆನ್ ಅ ಅನಾಲಿಸಿಸ್ ಆಫ್ ದೇವಲ ಸ್ಮೃತಿ. ದಟ್ಸ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ವೆರಿ ವ್ಯಾಲ್ಯೂಬಲ್ ವರ್ಕ್. ಸೊ ಅಂದರೆ ಅವ್ರ ರೇಂಜ್ ಹೇಳೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಇದು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಬಟ್ ದ ರಿಯಲ್ ಗ್ಲೋರಿ ಆಫ್ ಶ್ರೀ ಆಲ್ಟೇಕರ್ rests mainly on three pillars. The first was his immeasurable contributions in promoting and elevating the study of numismatics, that is, the study of coins. There was something called the Society of Numismatics, which was first established by the British in 1909, if I'm not mistaken. And Altekar inherited this society from the British in 1947, and he became its first chairman, and he took it to newer heights. ನೀವು ಅವ್ರ ಕಮೆಮರೇಷನ್ ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್ ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ, ಆಲ್ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ ಎವ್ರಿ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಹೂ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ಯೂಲಜೈಸ್ಡ್ ಆಲ್ಟೇಕರ್ಸ್ ಲೆಗಸಿ, invariably bulk of his eulogy rests on how Altekar took this numismatic society of India, how he expanded it to phenomenal levels. And lack of time prevents me from giving a more comprehensive information about his work on numismatics. And in fact, the same Vasudev Sharan Agarwala, he pays rich tribute to Altekar in this regard. Quote, "No single man had before him rendered such a meritorious and permanent service to the cause of the numismatic society. He conceived the idea of a permanent home for the society and raised money for it by extreme resourcefulness." Close quote. The second pillar of his eminence rests on his stupendous efforts in archaeology, especially in Bihar, ancient Magadha kingdom. It is actually incredible when we learn that Sri Altekar took up field level or on-site archaeology excavation when he was in his late 40s. He took up archaeology with unmatched passion, like a child that has discovered a new toy and can't get enough of it. ಅದರ ಬಗ್ಗೆನೂ ತುಂಬ ಬ್ರಿಲಿಯಂಟಾಗಿ ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ it was also Sri Altekar who first unearths the remains of the ancient city of Vaishali. Mukhal Pal Vaishali Pustkana, ಈ ವೈಶಾಲಿಕೆ ನಗರಬಹುದು ಇವೆಲ್ಲ, it is based on the primary field work done by Altekar. On Vaishali, all great Buddhist and Mauryan sites, and Sonepur or Sonpur, situated on the banks of the river Gandaki. And Altekar thereby single-handedly gave a fresh direction in the research, field level research, related to the Mauryan Empire and the Buddhist era, broadly speaking. One of his later disciples and scholar, archaeologist in his own right, Dr. George Moraes, he has written a very beautiful obituary to Altekar, and he describes the impact of his Bihar excavations very beautifully. Kumrahar and Vaishali were brought back to life from long neglect, and Sonepur arose as a new star in the Indian archaeological firmament. The excavations which he conducted at Patna resulted in the discovery of some unique antiquities, such as the square base of the round Mauryan pillar, the like of which has so far been unknown. This is original research, excavation. And so, all the various drawings, pictures, all the photographs of these Mauryan and Buddhist sites that we see in Bihar and in general in the site of the ancient Magadha Empire, in books, in films, on the internet, all these are the direct results of Altekar's pioneering field work. And the third and the perhaps most important edifice of Sri Altekar's fame and his legacy is his original researches in the history of the Gupta Empire. ಪುಣ್ಯಾತ್ಮರು ಎಷ್ಟು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಇದರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಸೆಪ್ರೇಟಾಗಿ ಮಾಡೋಣ ಒಂದು ಸಲ. It was actually Sri A.S. Altekar who for the first time wrote the comprehensive history of Ramagupta, the son of Samudragupta. He published this for the first time in a paper dated 1928. Apart from this, his two works, Catalogue of the Gupta coins in the Bayana Hoard and Coins of the Gupta Empire. These are his seminal masterpieces on the subject, numismatics of the Gupta Empire. Of these, his efforts at discovering the Bayana Hoard of coins, it is truly the stuff of legends. Till date, the Bayana Hoard is the largest collection of coins to have been ever discovered in the history of Indian archaeology. ಈ ರೆಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ತನಕ ಯಾರೋ ಬೀಟ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗಿಲ್ಲ. The total number of Gupta coins discovered in this hoard is 1,821 coins of different sizes, shapes, weights, varieties, designs and styles. Now, ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಚಿಕ್ಕ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ಇದೆ. Bayana is a small village in Rajasthan. This Bayana had once been a flourishing commercial city, one of the commercial capitals of the Gupta Empire, and sometime in the 5th century CE, when the Hunas launched a barbaric invasion, one of the Gupta governors there, he fled from Bayana to a safe place. From then, up to March 23rd, 1948, some boys in the village of Bayana, they were randomly digging the earth and they accidentally unearthed some coins. And when this news spread, Dr. Altekar was in Patna, I think, and he immediately came down to Bayana and began investigating these coins. He ordered a full-scale excavations in and around Bayana, and with extraordinary patience and diligence and hard work, he worked non-stop for about 6 years and finally produced something called the Catalogue of the Gupta coins in the Bayana Hoard in 1954. He found that the last time that anybody had seen these Gupta coins were in the year 455 CE. Lekha ki time period. This was the year that these coins had been buried by the Gupta king or the Mandaleshwara. And Shri Altekar has also given a highly detailed and accurate descriptions of each coin in his catalogue. It contains, I think, about 450 beautifully illustrated photographic plates with details of its legend and descriptions of their significance. ಸೊ ಇಂಥದಕ್ಕೆಲ್ಲ ನಾವು ಏನು ಹೇಳಬೇಕು ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ಐ ಥಿಂಕ್ ಆನ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್ ರ್ಯಾದರ್ ಇನ್ಕಂಪ್ಲೀಟ್ ನೋಟ್ we can conclude today's session, because I have a lot of notes made here, but you can go on and on. But I hope that it suffices from the examples of all these great stalwarts, not only their methods of work, but their inner attitude, their tapassadrishvada ಒಂದು ದೀಕ್ಷೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರಲ್ಲ, that kind of work in a subject like history. I mean, history ನೆಪ ಮಾತ್ರ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದು. This whatever notes that I've made about these observations I've made about these stalwarts of Indian history is pretty much applicable to stalwarts in all different fields, being art, architecture, music, dance, sculpture, temple traditions, philosophy, and so on. So, like I said, on that rather unfinished and incomplete note, we can conclude today's session, and I have merely scratched the surface so far, but I hope that it has given you a flavor of the enormity, the profundity, and the dedication of the inheritance, of the bequest of these titans of Indian history. And as always, I am indebted to the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs and all its staff. I'm thankful to Shri Shashikiran and all of you in the audience for giving me a patient hearing. Namaste.
Thank you, Sandeep. Sandeep, towards the end, called his talk unfinished and incomplete, but I must say it was edifying and ennobling, which counts for much more than a complete talk. What Sandeep did was to give us a representative sample of what went behind the thought processes and life principles of the people who considered history their life calling. Instead of giving a lifeless bulleted list of the 10-point or 20-point program or 5-year plans of what makes history and historiography, Sandeep gave us examples, concrete life examples from the lives of such great history exemplars. And this goes on to illustrate and highlight Sandeep's own extensive study of history as a discipline. He is not a trained historian in the strictest term, in the academic sense, but he has studied history because he likes it and loves it for his own commitment to truth, as he brought out at the beginning of the talk. And an example from our own state and our own time perhaps might not be out of place. When the great scholar T.V. Venkatachala Shastri set out to write his dictionary on elephantology, Gadashastra Shabdakosha, the other giant of Indian history and Kannada learning, Nadoja M. Chidanandamurthy, made a very pertinent and very perceptive remark that were I to take up the writing of such a dictionary, I would have headed straight to Sakkare Bailu or such places, Heggada Devanakote, and would have learned first hand from the mahouts and other elephant keepers about how elephants are trained, how they are procured, how they are preserved and protected, and such like tactics. And Dr. T.V. Venkatachala Shastri is a scholar of a different kind. He has ransacked all the libraries, went to the nook and corners of all the primary sources, and has preserved for us the various shades in which the technical terms related to Gajashastra are used. So what we need to draw from Sandeep's own talk is perhaps a combination of both these callings. One is to go to the places where these actual disciplines are lived, Like Sandeep said, Indian civilization is not a wounded civilization, it is a living, throbbing, vibrant civilization. So, that practical application of mind on the one hand and unswerving commitment to truth and backbending and time consuming research with fidelity to truth, with the understanding of primary sources on the other hand, will go a long way in furthering the interests of Indian history. I thank Sandeep Balakrishna once again for doing ample justice to the topic on hand. This was a very great talk, and to us, all of us at the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs, we think that the annual day is very well celebrated. Thank you all, and thanks everyone for patient hearing.